Tonight, we step back into the fog-drenched alleys of Victorian England, where the beds are lumpy, the air is thick with coal smoke and snoring. Might actually be considered a character flaw. You're standing in a narrow room on the top floor of a creaky townhouse, one of those places where even the silence sounds like it's whispering something ominous. The walls are paper-thin, the gaslights flicker with a gentle hiss. And you've just realized the mattress under you is made entirely of tightly packed horsehair. Welcome to sleep. Victorian style, the pillow feels more like a decorative rock than a cloud. Your blanket hand-stitched and probably stuffed with straw itches, just enough to keep you semi-conscious. If you're lucky, the Chambermaid aired out your sheets this morning by draping them over a soot-blackened window ledge. If not, well, you're now intimately acquainted with the smell of damp wool and 10-day-old sweat. You take a breath and cough immediately. That's the coal soot in your lungs. A standard nighttime guest for anyone living in London, Manchester, or really any industrial hub, where chimneys outnumber trees by a ratio of about 100 to 1. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake enough to type, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pull your worn blanket tighter, your candle sputters, you hear the distant clop of a horse-drawn carriage and the faint creak of pipes, maybe water, maybe rats. Sleep is something you chase, not something you fall into. And the Victorians were nothing if not creative in the chase. Let's start with the very basics, the bed itself. Unless you're of considerable means, your bed frame is likely made of wood, possibly pine or oak, but the headboard is for show. What really matters is what's stuffed inside the bed. Ticking. In this case, a solid mass of horsehair. Why horsehair, you ask? Because it was cheap, springy, and this is true. It sounded luxurious to Victorian ears. Never mind that it smells vaguely like wet barn on humid nights. If you're wealthier, perhaps you have a bed with metal springs, but fair warning, these early contraptions tend to squeal and groan with every breath you take, turning a quiet shift in position into a full-blown ghost story. Historians still argue whether these beds were more status symbols or sleep deterrents. Either way, you're not turning over without waking the entire household and possibly the neighbor's parrot. The room around you isn't helping either. Your walls are likely layered in flocked wallpaper, possibly lined with lead paint. Your drapes, thick velvet meant to block out the cold and the stench of outside, do a fine job of sealing in mildew. Instead, the air is heavy still and full of particulates. You might have a window cracked, but the breeze that drifts in smells faintly of horse manure and chimney soot. Still, for all the discomfort, you'd be considered lucky. Working-class families often shared beds or even slept in shifts. A mother and child might share one end, an uncle or older sibling the other. The concept of a private bedroom was a luxury, and one not granted to many. Then there's the question of heat, or the lack thereof. Unless you've got a fireplace and someone to tend it, your only real source of warmth is whatever you're sleeping in. Long johns, woolen stockings, and maybe a nightcap, not the drinking kind, the literal one with a tassel, are your best defense. Forget cozy electric blankets. If you want to get warm, you'd better hope someone remembered to slip a hot brick or a warming pan under the sheets an hour ago. As you lie back, because standing would be too exhausting, you start to notice the small sounds, the ticking of the wall clock, the scratch of mice behind the wainscoting, the rasping wheeze of Grandpa's bronchial cough in the next room. You're not alone even when you are. Some believed a stuffy room was bad for the brain. Others were convinced that drafts would kill you. So people compromised in weird ways by cracking windows, only an inch, and stuffing towels underneath doors to trap the warmth. A few forward-thinking folks even installed rudimentary air tubes, wooden vents drilled through walls to funnel what they called God's own freshness from the outside. Did it work? Well, considering most city air included particles of arsenic soot, and the odd rat, maybe not. And then there's your bedding companion lice, or bed bugs, or both. You scratch, you pretend it's the wool, but in the back of your mind you know Everyone knew bedbugs were just part of the experience. Some people smoked them out. Others sprinkled camphor or lavender between the sheets, which worked about as well as using perfume on a landfill. Of course, this didn't stop anyone from trying. Household manuals of the time offered recipes for homemade insect repellents, often involving turpentine vinegar and hope. One particularly bold pamphlet recommended placing onion slices around the bed legs to confuse the vermin's pathfinding, which frankly raises more questions than answers. By now, you've likely noticed something else: the darkness. It's not just the absence of light, it's the thick, velvet sort of dark that presses in Victorian bedrooms. Didn't glow with ambient light or gentle LEDs. Once the brass candle goes out, it's just you, the shadows, and your thoughts, which is how insomnia started for many a quiet room. A creaky floorboard, and too much time to think about whether your neighbor has consumption or just a bad cough. Still, you're not completely defenseless. There's always prayer, or counting backward from 100, or if you're truly desperate, reciting multiplication tables while imagining you're in a field full of sleeping cows. An actual remedy, suggested in an 1873 children's manual on moral rest. You roll to one side, the bed frame groans. Your foot hits something cold and metallic. It's the chamber pot. Congratulations. You've now completed the first phase of Victorian bedtime, and somehow you're still not asleep. You wake, or rather realize you never truly fell asleep. The candle's gone out. The room is darker now, somehow heavier, like the shadows grew thicker overnight. But the chill hasn't left you. Sit up slowly, the presence and some horsehair mattress crunching like a sack of straw beneath you. Somewhere downstairs a floorboard creaks. Could be the cat, could be your mother, could be the ghost of last winter's flu. It's time to begin the Victorian bedtime ritual again, because back then falling asleep wasn't just something that happened, it was a task, a chore, a multi-step process that sometimes required spiritual, chemical, and architectural interventions. Tonight, you're taking the scenic route. First, stop the candle. You fumble for your matches, finding only one left in the tin. You strike it successfully, though you burn your thumb in the process and relight the wick. A soft orange glow returns, casting a halo on the wallpaper, revealing patterns of birds and roses that feel oddly judgmental. Now comes the awkward part, relieving yourself. The chamber pot sits silently beneath the bed like a loyal servant or an accident waiting to happen. Victorian homes, especially in cities, lacked indoor plumbing until far later than you'd expect. Even in affluent homes, a full-fledged bathroom was a novelty. So you shuffle half asleep over to the pot, hoping to maintain your dignity. Don't knock it over, don't breathe too deeply, and definitely don't forget to put the lid back on unless you want tomorrow morning to smell like a stable floor. Victorian bedrooms weren't just for sleeping, of course, they were for everything: dressing, praying, sitting quietly, having deep moral regrets. The furniture tells the story. A washstand crouches in the corner, its porcelain bowl full of Bext, yesterday's water. There's a towel stiff with use, a brush with someone else's hair still wound through the bristles. No toothpaste, but a pot of charcoal powder you dab on your finger. You wash up in silence, maybe you hum, maybe the sound of your teeth grinding the grit of the powder is enough. If you're a woman, you untie your corset, a nightly act that feels somewhere between a ritual and an exorcism. If you're a man, you loosen your collar and wonder if sleep will come easier without your cravat slowly trying to choke you. Now the candlelight flickers toward the ceiling, catching dust motes that dance like sleepy fairies. It smells faintly of tallow animal fat for the uninitiated, and it burns unevenly, sometimes dripping wax onto your nightstand or the sleeve of your nightshirt. Candles are a luxury in quantity, so you learn to stretch their life. Snuffers, mirrors to double the light. You've tried it all. You'd trade a silver spoon for an electric lamp, but it's 1852. And Thomas Edison is still chewing on ideas at the breakfast table. The silence, however, is absolute. Until it isn't. The boards above your head groan. The servant girl is walking back to her attic room, the one with no insulation and a mattress filled with straw. If she's lucky, you think of her shuffling past the coals, trying not to wake anyone. She's 16, works 16 hours a day, sleeps 6 on a good night. You lie back again, your bones adjust to the mattress or the mattress adjusts to you. The blanket doesn't do much. Maybe it's a woolen coverlet inherited from your great-aunt already threadbare. Or perhaps a quilt made from fabric scraps, pretty to look at. Less pretty when the wind whistles in through the window gaps. And now we come to the soundtrack of the night: creaking wood, ticking clocks, coughing relatives whined through loose panes, and the occasional bark of a stray dog in the alley. If you're middle class, you might own a mantle, clock heavy, brass winding key required. And the ticking, unforgiving, the sound of seconds being flung one by one into the dark. This is when you begin to feel it, the creeping anxiety, not of monsters, no, of productivity. Victorian society was obsessed with industry, routine, and purpose. To lie awake doing nothing was borderline sinful. Laziness was the devil's playground. Entire books warned against too much sleep. Tracts spoke of idle beds as breeding grounds for temptation. You're not just fighting insomnia, you're defending your reputation. One popular household guide written by a Mrs. Ellis in 1844 urged women to rise with the sun and slumber not before the duties of the day have ended. Historians still argue whether these maxims were genuinely believed or simply a way for upper-class authors to scold working-class readers, and yet people still did sleep eventually. Somehow, maybe it was the sound of the coal fire in another room crackling, maybe it was the whisper of your own breathing slowing, or the comfort of routine. You always brush your hair 50 times before bed, you always fold your socks, you always whisper goodnight to the framed silhouette of your late uncle on the dresser. He looks stern. You suspect he didn't sleep much either. Sometimes you'd try counting, not sheep, that wasn't a thing yet. You'd count verses from scripture, or buttons on your shirt, or the number of tiny imperfections in the ceiling plaster. Each one feels like a crater in the moon. Then there are the nighttime visitors, not human ones, mice, spiders, the occasional moth suiciding into your candle. You pretend they're not there, you shift deeper under the covers. You wonder if tomorrow's chores will go easier if you close your eyes right now, and still sleep does not arrive. But what has arrived is a sense of resignation. This is the Victorian way: you endure, you wait. You try another position flat on your back like a corpse in a novel. You think about the family next door whose baby cries every night. You think about how lucky you are to have a bed and four walls, and yes, even the chamber pot. Eventually your breathing slows, your eyes flutter, and just as you're about to drift off, the floor creaks again. You blink, unsure whether the sound was real, or simply the echo of a thought slipping loose. The creak has passed. Nothing moves now, but the flame on the candle dancing, low and lazy in its final inch of wax. You adjust the blanket again. A ritual by now. The same way someone stirs their tea without thinking. If the bedbugs are biting, they're at least subtle about it tonight. You sigh, and that's when it occurs to you you're not the only one wide awake. Welcome to the unspoken society of Victorian insomniacs. The men and women who lived their most wakeful lives between midnight and dawn. You hear them sometimes. The muffled piano note from the parlor below, the faint rustle of a page turning, or even the soft clink of glass against glass. Someone, somewhere in the house, is pouring something strong, perhaps from a hidden decanter. In this era, sleeplessness isn't just a nuisance. It's become fashionable among the elite. They call it midnight inspiration, or more dramatically, the blessing of nocturnal clarity. You, of course, just call it irritating, but if you were to creep downstairs candle in hand and peek into the drawing room, you might find your father hunched over ledgers by firelight, or your sister writing verse by hand, in her diary pages upon pages of carefully inked laments about love, destiny, or a particularly unkind milliner. The truth is, Victorian society had a curious relationship with nighttime wakefulness. For the working poor, being awake after hours was a sign of overwork, exhaustion, or unpaid labor. But for the upper-class, insomnia could be romanticized. Poets praised the still hours, philosophers wrote essays on the sacred hush of midnight. Historians still argue whether this was genuine reflection or just self-important whining with a fancy pen. You picture a man named Harold, let's call him that, an aging barrister with a mustache. You could lose a pen in pacing the creaky floors of his study at 2 a.m. He claims to suffer from a nervous temperament, which translates to too much roast beef and unresolved issues. But in society, he's admired. A man of depth, of tireless thought. And then there's Agnes, 43, unmarried, owns 3 cats, and is halfway through a novel she'll never finish. She says the quiet of night is her only true peace. But you've seen her consume 2 brandies and an opium lozenge before, setting quill to parchment so the piece may be chemically assisted. Still, these people gather not in person but in spirit. The unspoken members of the Midnight Oil Club, where sleep is optional and deep thinking is compulsory. If you had a bit more energy, you might join them. You sit up, the candle's down to its stub, now curling in on itself like a dying flower. You remember what someone once told you, that 2 sleeps were the natural way. First, sleep from sundown to midnight, then a quiet, wakeful interlude, followed by a second sleep until dawn. This was common knowledge in the early 1800s when street lighting was rare. And darkness lasted a true 12 hours. No screens, no trains, just your thoughts, a bit of reading, maybe some prayer. Maybe this is your interlude. Maybe you're doing it right. You pick up a book from the nightstand, it's heavy, the spine cracked long ago. You open it to a random page and squint at the words. The script is ornate, the ink faded. You recognize it, one of those Victorian guides for proper ladies, filled with rules on posture, prayer, and how to eat a pear without appearing lustful. Useful, really. Your favorite passage is still bookmarked. A lady who slumbers beyond necessity, risks an inflamed spleen, and the gossip of maids. You chuckle softly, or maybe you groan, it's hard to tell anymore. Meanwhile, someone in your building is coughing again, maybe the cook whose lungs are filled with coal, smoke, and flour, or the footman who sleeps near the scullery and swears he's allergic to cold. In any case, they're up to, perhaps, they never went down. Across the city, the truly desperate are pacing their own rooms, clutching tonic bottles and spooning strange powders into hot milk. Laudanum is the Victorian insomniac's best friend and worst enemy. A mixture of opium and alcohol, it knocks you out, sometimes permanently. But it's available without a prescription and comes in beautiful bottles, so what could go wrong? And then there's chloral hydrate, the so-called knockout drops preferred by anxious husbands and exhausted wives alike. Mixed into a cup of tea, it brings sleep within minutes. Also nightmares, and sometimes unconscious drooling. Historians still argue whether it was more medicine or moral failing. Your neighbor, Mr. Greaves, swears by his personal mixture, equal parts lavender oil, gin, and soft chanting in ancient Greek. You've never asked him what he chants. You've never had the courage. You lie back once more, closing the book. The candle is all but gone now. Wax has formed a little lake in the dish. You tilt your head, trying to avoid the lump in the mattress, which feels suspiciously like a forgotten fork. The tick-tock of the mantel clock resumes its grip on your eardrums. Each second lands like a metronome on your thoughts. You consider turning the clock away, but it's part of the furniture, part of the ritual. And besides, it's the only thing reminding you that time is still moving, even if you are not. Somewhere outside, the street lamp hisses, gas-powered and unpredictable. It casts a faint cone of light on the cobblestones. You see a figure move, perhaps the lamplighter finishing his rounds, or a cat, or something else you're not going to check. Instead, you curl your toes under the blanket. It's scratchy again. The horsehair tickles your elbow, but you're strangely comfortable now, lulled by the thought that somewhere out there, Harold and Agnes are also awake, also wondering whether it's too late for a second dinner. And if not sleep, at least you have solidarity. You're still awake, and so are the Victorians. Because if there's one thing this era excelled at, besides creating incredibly ornate teapots, it was bottling up problems, wrapping them in lace, and selling them as solutions. And nowhere is this more obvious than in their approach to sleep. You shift slightly, causing the entire bed frame to groan like a disapproving butler. That's when you remember there's a bottle under the bed. It's not yours, of course. It's your uncle's, left behind when he visited last winter. He claimed it was the only tonic worth taking before bed. And you believed him. Mostly because he fell asleep instantly, every night, snoring like a foghorn in a tea. Cozy, you reach for it, cautious of spiders and dust bunnies. There it is, dark green glass. The cork slightly crusty. The label promising a miraculous blend of valerian root ether and something ambiguously labeled soothing spirits. Victorians loved their sleep potions. The market was flooded with patent remedies, each with a more grandiose name than the last. Dr. Beecham's elixir of rest, Lady Violet's nocturnal drops, Reverend Green's soul-calming syrup. Most of them contained generous helpings of opiates, alcohol, or both. But hey, at least the packaging was pretty. You uncork the bottle and take a cautious sniff. Instantly, your nose is hit by a bouquet of herbs, vinegar, and something you strongly suspect is turpentine. It's not pleasant, but it's persuasive. You put the bottle back. Not tonight. The Victorians didn't have the FDA. Or common sense, really. Sleep tonics were largely unregulated, and pharmacists often prepared their own concoctions on site, adjusting the recipes based on what sounded fancy, or what hadn't killed anyone. Recently, historians still argue whether these mixtures were truly intended to induce sleep, or just dull the body enough to stop caring. One especially popular ingredient, opium, available at corner shops and apothecaries. It was sold in various forms: pills, tinctures, powders, even candies for children. Laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, was considered a household staple, like olive oil or baking soda. Everyone had it, everyone used it, and no one talked about it too much, especially not after Aunt Josephine passed out into the cake at Christmas. Then there was chlorodyne, a powerful mixture of chloroform, morphine, and cannabis. It was marketed for everything from insomnia to coughing fits, to female agitation, which was basically a catch-all term for existing while female. Many Victorians swore by it, a few swore at it, and several died with the bottle still clutched in their hands. You lie back and imagine yourself as a 19th century pharmacist, surrounded by tiny bottles and mortar and pestle dreams. The customers shuffle in with weary eyes and trembling hands. You offer them a syrup made from willow, bark, and rosewater. It doesn't work, but it smells nice, and they leave slightly comforted. You feel oddly proud. Some remedies were less sinister: milk with nutmeg, chamomile stews, warm cider mixed with molasses, and a prayer. You once read about a tea made from boiled lettuce water. It tasted like regret, but was supposedly mildly sedative. Of course so is, being hit with a pillow repeatedly. But no one's bottling that. The quirkier among the Victorians turned to aromatherapy. Not the essential oils you know now. No. These were pungent poultices of lavender, pennyroyal, and crushed fennel wrapped in muslin sachets and shoved directly under your nose. Some even sewed herbs into their pillows, which made for a very fragrant, if somewhat sneezy, experience. You remember reading an article dated 1868 that recommended placing a slice of raw onion near the bed to draw out night vapors. What exactly night vapors were, the author didn't specify, but you're sure they weren't pleasant. You also recall the advice to rub the temples with vinegar of sage, a phrase that sounds like an ancient curse, but was genuinely printed in a medical journal. There was no shortage of confidence, only results. You flip your pillow over an act that even in 1850 had the power to suggest fresh hope. But hope is fleeting. So you reach again for the bedside drawer and find something even more ridiculous: Snore No More. A practical guide to the practical guide. A player. Sleepy Marital Union. 1853 edition. You've seen this before. It's a thin book printed cheaply, filled with stern advice. You open to a random page and find a section titled, "Of Nasal Noises and Their Correction." The first suggestion: pin the sleeper's mouth shut with a silk ribbon. The second, a breathing cage, a leather contraption that straps over the head and keeps the mouth closed through sheer Victorian willpower. If the snoring continues, the book recommends a light slap on the shoulder administered gently but with firm Christian intent. You're not sure what that means, but it sounds ominous. Some inventors took it further. You've heard stories of devices resembling brass beaks worn like a muzzle designed to redirect airflow. Others involved harnesses that forced the sleeper onto their side because everyone knew snoring was worst while on your back. A few even designed beds that tilted when snoring began, supposedly shifting the sleeper into a quieter position. These were rare and largely experimental, mostly because they flung people out of bed. Historians still argue whether these inventions were genuine attempts at comfort or passive-aggressive tools of marital revenge. You chuckle and close the book. Somewhere outside, a dog barks. A drunk sings the same verse twice. A carriage rattles by. You're not any sleepier, but you're oddly calmer. Maybe it's the comfort of knowing you're not the first to struggle with sleep. Maybe it's just the laugh from the phrase, firm Christian intent. The flame finally dies. Darkness settles in completely soft and cool, wrapping around you like a thick curtain. You close your eyes. You do not fall asleep, but at least now you're entertained. You're lying there in the soft black soup of pre-dawn, drifting somewhere between tired and insulted. You've tried the tea, you've read the book, you've pondered snore cages and sniffed possibly toxic tinctures. And yet sleep continues to circle just out of reach, mocking you like a polite ghost with a parasol. You begin to wonder, was it always this hard? Surely not every Victorian tossed and turned on a bed of questionable stuffing with their brain howling at the moon. And yet the more you think about it, the more you realize they didn't just struggle with sleep, they judged it. Especially when it didn't behave. Enter the sleep hygiene evangelists. Yes, even in the age of gas lamps and corsets, there were experts self-appointed, mostly who treated insomnia, not as a physical affliction, but as a moral failing. If you couldn't sleep, it wasn't because of environmental profit, discomfort, or the Prines, 20 opium-laced syrups you'd chugged that week. It was because you lacked discipline, or worse, temperance. You picture one such reformer now, Miss Prudence Ashworth, fictional in name but spiritually real. Dressed in high collar and gloves, she conducts seminars on domestic rectitude and the art of righteous rest. Her pamphlets advise early rising, vigorous walks, cold baths, and abstaining from novels, especially the French ones. She believes truly virtuous people fall asleep within 9 minutes of head-to-pillow contact. Of course, Prudence herself likely sleeps with the aid of a heavy wool blanket, 6 copies of the Psalms, and a mild opiate for her digestion. Many in Victorian society saw rest as something to be earned. You worked hard, you prayed harder, and then maybe you were allowed the gift of sleep, but only after repenting for any idle thoughts you might have had since tea time. Historians still argue whether this attitude stemmed more from Protestant work ethic or sheer stubbornness. Either way, it led to some frankly absurd regimens. Take Dr. Samuel Smiles, whose book Self-Help 1859 became a moral cornerstone of the era. He didn't write much about sleep, but when he did, it was clear he viewed too much of it as suspicious. His readers took note. Suddenly, oversleeping wasn't just lazy, it was almost criminal. You think about that now as you lie awake in the dark. Somewhere Prudence Ashworth would be tesking loudly. Did you say your prayers? Did you trim your candle properly? Did you think unholy thoughts about your neighbor's fencing instructor? She's not wrong, he did have a fine set of mutton chops. This moral panic around rest led to a curious paradox. The Victorians were obsessed with sleep, but only the right kind of sleep. Dreamless, silent, and still snoring was frowned upon. Tossing and turning, a sign of spiritual unrest. Napping, during the day, almost scandalous. Even dreams were subject to scrutiny. If you had unsettling ones, clearly you'd eaten improperly, or committed some subtle vice. Good dreams meant you were pure of intention, and apparently had abstained from rhubarb tarts at supper. It wasn't just preachers and pamphleteers. Parents too enforced sleep as a behavior to be corrected. Children were expected to sleep on command. No exceptions. A fussy child was not tired. They were willful. One popular child-rearing manual insisted that the child must learn to rest its body as it learns to fold its hands. You tried folding your hands just now. Didn't help. So you roll onto your side again, the candle is gone, and now it's just the pale blue wash of early morning leaking through the curtains. You trace a finger through the cold condensation on the window pane. Outside, the city murmurs. Milk, carts, rattle. A church bell yawns to life, and still your mind won't stop, because once you've been told that not sleeping makes you a moral failure, it's hard to unhear it, even if it's 1,850. Even if the bedbugs agree with you. The evangelists weren't all gloom, though. Some offered helpful if highly impractical advice. A list of recommendations from the Gentlewoman's Domestic Guide 1871 includes bathe the feet in rose water whilst reciting lines from Tennyson, avoid impure thoughts, avoid fruit, listen to the ticking of a clock until your soul aligns with time, do not argue with your husband after sunset. You imagine someone earnestly trying this, sitting with their feet in a porcelain bowl whispering, "Come into the garden, Maud. while avoiding the seductive shape of a pear. You want to laugh, but it's more of a sigh now. Meanwhile, the medical professionals were slowly beginning to weigh in. Some Victorian doctors, frustrated by the syrup sellers and pamphlet writers, started exploring the science of sleep. They called it nocturnal neurosis, or the fatigue of mind, in absence of physical labor, which you'll note is a very Victorian way of saying you think too much and don't lift enough buckets. One physician, Dr. George Beard, coined the term neurasthenia, a catch-all diagnosis for tiredness, sadness, anxiety, and generally being alive. He believed sleeplessness was a symptom of modernity: trains, telegrams, typewriters, all too fast, all too stimulating. His solution? Rest cures isolation. And, more often than not, electrotherapy. But that's for later. For now, you lie still, listening to the world unfurl outside your window. Somewhere a neighbor opens their shutters. The bakery below prepares dough. The chimney stacks begin their daily routine of turning fresh morning air into gray smoke. And though you haven't slept, you've learned this much. Insomnia in the Victorian world wasn't just a medical condition. It was a character flaw, a moral battleground, a social minefield. It was the quiet terror of failing to fall asleep correctly. Still, maybe, just maybe, knowing all this helps. You're not broken. You're just Victorian tonight. The morning light begins to touch the tops of the buildings outside, stretching across the rooftops like a cat waking from its own delicious nap. You haven't slept. Not really. But somehow you feel more at ease, or at least more entertained. Because while modern insomniacs have blue light and caffeine to blame, the Victorians blamed everything else. Tonight, or rather this very early morning, you've decided to try something new, something the reformers hated. You're going to lie still, not think about virtue, not worry about your soul. Just listen. Tick-tock tick. You let the clock lull you until it doesn't, because that ticking, that never-ending wooden-throated click-clack, it's starting to feel like judgment incarnate. And now you understand why so many Victorians developed a brassiere, deep and irrational hatred of clocks. Every respectable household had one. It was a symbol of discipline, of order. But at 3:37 a.m., it felt more like an accusation, as if with each second it was whispering, still awake. Lazy bones, probably full of sinful toast and bad opinions. You briefly consider throwing a sock at it, but you don't. You're far too British even in imagination. Instead, you remember something from a sleep manual you once read. The mind, if too active, must be led gently by repetition into stillness. And so you count. Not sheep. Victorians weren't big on that. No, you count something else. Teacups. Rows and rows of delicate china on invisible shelves, each with a tiny pink rose slightly chipped, each waiting for someone to take the first alv. Sip. 1, 2, 3. By teacup 13, your mind is already drifting. Not to sleep, no, but to another eccentric corner of the Victorian world bedroom design. Because, as it turns out, the Victorians had opinions. Enter the scientifically optimized sleeping chamber. Sounds impressive, doesn't it? It wasn't. You sit up again, not because you're awake, but because you're curious now. In Victorian England, there was a whole cottage industry of experts advising people on how to construct the perfect bedroom for sleep. And these weren't just decorators. They were moralists, physicians, amateur architects, and the occasional spiritualist with a side interest in wallpaper. According to these guides, a bedroom should face east, so that the morally invigorating morning light would strike your face first. Contain no mirrors lest you catch your own soul unprepared at night. Have no paintings, especially of boats, birds, or women reclining, for fear they might induce restless thoughts. Be painted in neutral tones like beige, sage green, or melancholy gray. Victorians believed in harmony. Feng shui, if you will, but with extra wallpaper and fewer dragons. They advised that beds be made of iron rather than wood to avoid pest harboring. And indeed, iron bed frames cool to the touch, clangy as dinner. Bells became all the rage, but it didn't stop there. One gentleman inventor proposed air tubes to funnel fresh outdoor air directly into the sleeping area. The tubes would snake through the wall and terminate near the pillow, delivering what he called nighttime nourishment. Another guide insisted that sleepers should wash their feet in cold water just before bed, then climb under the covers without drying them to cool the humors and prevent burning dreams. Historians still argue whether these recommendations helped or simply kept people too cold and uncomfortable to stay awake. And then There were the wall-mounted smelling salts. You remember those, the little glass vials filled with ammonia compounds and lavender oil, meant to jolt you awake or paradoxically relax your senses. Mounted like sconces, they were available to sniff if you felt nervous or beset by dark imaginings, which, judging by the decor in some of these bedrooms, was highly likely. As for furniture, less was more. A small bed, a washstand, one hard chair for sitting and regretting, and perhaps a modest bookcase. Curtains were allowed, but they must not be too red. Red curtains were said to inflame the senses, though no one could agree whether this meant romance, rage, or indigestion. You lie back and imagine it now. A room painted in sorrowful beige, smelling faintly of ammonia and old lemons, with a draft slipping through the eaves like a cold-blooded house guest. You wonder how anyone slept at all, but of course some did, and others didn't, which is why they invented foot baths. Yes, foot baths were the self-care ritual of their day, a small copper tub, a splash of warm water, a sprinkle of herbs. Some families even owned dedicated foot-warming stools with compartments you'd fill with hot coals. It sounds proper, cozy, until you remember that many of those coals tipped, smoked, or occasionally lit slippers on fire. Still, there's something oddly comforting about the ritual. You imagine slipping your aching feet into warm water, the steam rising to your knees. You hum a lullaby. Your grandmother used to sing, something about plum pudding and dozing, hedgehogs. Then there's a sound outside, this time hooves a cart, maybe the milkman, maybe a constable, maybe someone returning from a late shift, hungry and tired and just as wide-eyed as you. You're not alone. Somewhere in the city, a whole constellation of other wakeful souls is navigating their own dark chambers, brushing lint from their nightgowns, turning pages, lighting stubs of candles, watching clocks. The night has its own population. You take comfort in that. You stretch slow and long, your joints cracking like old staircases. Your hand reaches for the edge of the blanket again, pulling it up just a little higher over your shoulder. The bedroom is not optimized. The walls are too close, the bed too flat, the silence too loud. But you somehow are content in this absurd little chamber of sleepy attempts. Because in a world where foot baths and ammonia jars were serious ideas, your modern pillow feels like a triumph. And maybe tonight that's enough. The hour has crept past 4. You don't need a clock to tell you. Your body knows the world is on the cusp of waking, and you're still caught in that peculiar fog of having almost rested, but not quite. Your eyes ache not from sleep, but from the strain of failing to find it. The ticking continues, joined now by the muffled thump of someone moving about below. A servant, perhaps, or a restless child. Or maybe just another soul who gave up trying to sleep. You lie still, blanketed by the strange comfort that comes only from surrender. There's nothing left to do. And that's when the guilt arrives. Because in the Victorian world, sleep wasn't simply a bodily function, it was a moral balancing act. And to miss it, to misuse it, that was to flirt with sloth, the enemy of industry. You begin to recall the pamphlets you've seen tucked between volumes at the lending library. The Drowsy Sin, Why God Frowns Upon the Overslept, Early to Bed, a treatise on slumber, and The Protestant Soul, Rouse Ye Slackers, The Devil Wakes with the Late. They were mostly sermons disguised as advice, but they did the job. Sleep, according to these grim little booklets, was to be earned. It was the reward for virtuous labor, and the correct number of spoons, polished or prayer beads counted. The act of sleeping in, or worse yet, napping, that was seen as suspicious. The domain of actors, poets, and people with weak moral backbones. One particularly absurd tract you once read warned against lingering in bed beyond the sun's rightful rise, lest it invite ungodly thoughts and digestive wind. Historians still argue whether this was satire or simply enthusiastic overreach by someone with too much vinegar in their tea. You turn your head toward the ticking again, feeling the pressure of time mounting like a teacher breathing down your neck. Not sleeping was bad, but not sleeping correctly, that was scandalous. Take the tale of one, Lady Winslow, real name, lost to history, but her story endures. She reportedly installed 3 separate clocks in her bedroom. One chimed every quarter hour, one ticked at precisely 58 beats per minute, and the third played soft chimes on the hour to gently herald dreams. She claimed it guided her toward righteous rest. You suspect it guided her straight into madness, but the fear of improper sleep was real. People whispered about those who lingered too long in bed. Women were especially vulnerable to judgment. A woman who slept late was either unwell or unchaste, possibly both. Men, on the other hand, were expected to bound out of bed ready for the ledger or the shovel, depending on class. To lie idle was to risk being accused of laziness, melancholy, or something far worse. French tendencies. This anxiety bled into literature. Characters who slept too much were always tragic or villainous. Think of Miss Havisham sitting in her bedroom, mausoleum stuck in the past. Or the opium-soaked gentlemen in penny dreadfuls drooling into their armchairs. Even fairy tales weren't safe. Sleeping Beauty was not a romantic ideal, but a cautionary tale about idleness, one only made acceptable because she was enchanted, and therefore not choosing to nap for a century. And so, the guilt grows. You tug the blanket up as if to shield yourself from societal judgment wafting through the keyhole. Even alone, you can almost hear Prudence Ashworth again. Slumber taken without purpose is but sloth in lace. Ironically, the pressure to sleep virtuously only made things worse. The more one worried, the less likely one was to drift off. The very act of trying became the enemy. This gave rise to a quiet epidemic of what they called clock-watching insomnia. People who stayed up hour after hour staring at the brass face of their mantel clocks, willing the hands forward or backward depending on whether they feared oversleeping or not sleeping at all. It was like time itself was a schoolmaster, and the bed a desk, and your dreams a failing grade. Some desperate souls tried tricks, turning the clock to face the wall, hiding it under the bed. One lady even placed hers in a cupboard, stuffed between linen sheets, then lay awake wondering if the ticking would suffocate. And yet, for all this guilt, there were glimpses of rebellion. You think of the artists, those disreputable creatures who dared to sleep in, who claimed their best ideas arrived after midnight and refused to apologize. Poets who wandered the streets until dawn, then slept till noon. Painters who converted their bedrooms into smoky dens of lazy genius. They were mocked, yes, but secretly envied, because while the moralists frothed about wasted hours, these nighttime minds were producing verses and portraits that would outlast all the ticking clocks combined. You roll onto your back again, the bed springs sighing under your weight. The guilt is still there, coiled like a cat at your feet, but you've seen enough of it now to name it, to nod politely and say, yes, I hear you, and no, I'm not ashamed, because rest is not a sin. And even the Victorians, those tireless purveyors of lace-trimmed discipline, couldn't quite conquer the simple, chaotic, beautiful mystery of sleep. So if you must stay awake a little longer, let it be without shame. Let the clock tick, let the room stay dim, let your mind wander through teacups and footbaths, through stern pamphlets and smothered clocks. The world outside is still. The window glass is pale with light. You are not failing. You are simply waiting. And perhaps that too is a kind of rest. The room is fading into gentle gray now, the blue of pre-dawn replaced by the smudged watercolor light of approaching morning. It paints the wallpaper once dramatic and dark into something more. Like fog, the corners of the room soften, the hard edges of the furniture blur. It's as though even the shadows are sighing, and yet you remain awake. Awake but quieter. You stare at the ceiling. Not out of frustration, but because you've found comfort in its predictability. The familiar cracks, the soft web of faded plaster lines like an ancient map you've traveled before. You know where it flakes, near the corner, where one seam bows like a sleeping wave. It's your night sky now. This is the moment when most Victorians would begin preparing for the day. But for those of us trapped in the long, slow crawl of sleeplessness, it's when things get weird. And by weird, I mean you begin seriously considering the latest innovation in sleep science. Victorian sleep science, that is. Which means we're now entering the curious world of rational bedrooms. These weren't simply designed to be comfortable, no, these were meant to optimize your moral fiber through interior decoration. You'd think you were just rearranging furniture, but according to the manuals and doctors of the day, you were actually fortifying your soul. Let's take a little tour. You sit up and imagine the ideal Victorian sleeping chamber circa 1885. First, there's the bed, of course. Metal frame, single pillow, covered in a blanket of gray wool that might also double as punishment. The bed is positioned diagonally, not for feng shui, but because a doctor named Percival Winsome argued that true rest only occurs when one sleeps with their head facing magnetic north. Historians still argue whether Percival was sincere or just wildly optimistic with a compass. The windows are narrow but high, heavy drapes of course, but they must be drawn at least a hand's breadth apart to allow God's light to gently purify the chamber. Never mind that most of God's light is bouncing off sooty brick, chimneys across the street. There's a modest bookcase, but only improving volumes are allowed. Novels, particularly French ones again, are banned. Too stimulating. Too emotional. Too many characters named Pierre who spend entire chapters staring at rain. The washstand is set precisely 3 paces from the bed, and your water basin is polished copper. A pitcher of cold water rests nearby. You do not drink it. You splash your face with it at dawn, while reciting Psalm 23, preferably aloud if you can do it without gasping. You're clearly on the righteous path. And in the corner, yes, the footbath again, this time fitted into a mahogany case that folds closed like a gentleman's liquor cabinet. You pour hot water inside if the maid has been up early. Add a drop of eucalyptus oil and rest your fate in it, while journaling about moral intentions for the day. If you don't have eucalyptus, mustard powder will do, or vinegar, or sea salt, or anything that stings a little. This wasn't just about sleep, it was about performance. The bedroom became a stage, and every item was a prop in the great moral theater of rest. That's why some households installed bedtime alarms, not to wake up but to go to bed. These were brass bells set to chime at, say, 9:15 p.m., the hour of decency. If you were caught awake after the second chime, you were seen as courting either madness or poetry. Possibly both. And lest you assume all this was just for show, there were consequences. Young ladies known to be late risers risked losing suitors. Men who slept past 7 were sometimes accused of melancholic inclinations. Even employers took note. 1862 London banker wrote that he only hired clerks who bathed cold at 6 and read psalms till breakfast. You think of him now somewhere in the distant past, splashing icy water onto his face, glancing at a grandfather clock, and congratulating himself on the virtue of his misery. You lie back again, eyes half closed as the imagined bedroom fades. Your own less optimized room surrounds you again. The lump in the mattress, the cooling air, the final drift of night. Still, you can't help but think about the smells, because even the air you breathed while sleeping was policed. Victorian manuals stressed the need for pure ventilation, though their definition was inconsistent at best. Some believed in sleeping with windows open, even in December, while others insisted that night air was dangerous, especially to women and infants. To combat this, enterprising homeowners invested in air filters made of charcoal wool and something called musked linen. Others hung camphor balls from the ceiling to ward off night vapors, unspecified miasmas that might cause nightmares, impure thoughts, or slightly uneven complexions. One particularly rich gentleman is said to have installed a velvet canopy above his bed, lined with crushed rose petals and pine shavings to perfume the soul during rest. You suspect he also owned far too many waistcoats. And then there were sleeping caps, not just for warmth, but for containment. Hair was believed to leak energy or psychic agitation during the night. Covering the head, it was thought protected the brain from both thoughts and chills. Some caps had lace. Some had wool tassels, some had pockets. You choose not to ask what for. You sigh, stretching again. The sky outside is fully awake now, but you're somewhere in between. Not asleep, not quite alert, but suspended like steam in a teacup, and maybe that's all you need. You close your eyes and for a moment your mind quiets, not because you've found the perfect ritual or aligned your feet with magnetic north, but because you've stopped trying. The bed creaks. The world waits, and sleep perhaps comes nearer. The day has arrived without your permission. Light now seeps past the heavy curtains, golden and silent, as though trying not to wake you. Though it's far too late for that. The walls are no longer looming, but faded and tame. And while the world stirs beyond the windows, your room remains still. It is morning in the Victorian bedroom, and you are not rested, neither are you surprised. You sit up slowly, the mattress sighing under you again, and stretch as best you can in a space where ceilings feel a touch too low and blankets a touch too itchy. If you were truly Victorian, you might ring for the maid, but you aren't. And the only thing waiting on you is another idea. Because now it's time to talk about something uniquely Victorian and uniquely strange. Hysteria, fainting couches, and the nervous bed. Yes. The moment the Victorians weren't blaming insomnia on sin or sloth. They were diagnosing it as part of something more dramatic. If you were a woman, especially one of means, you stood a good chance of being diagnosed with hysteria at least once in your life. The list of symptoms was vast and frankly suspiciously vague. Sleeplessness, anxiety, irritability, boredom, indigestion, excessive emotion, too little emotion, too much walking, not enough walking, and our favorite, nervousness without cause. You think of poor Eleanor, your fictional Victorian friend who once stayed up 3 nights in a row worrying about her piano recital. The doctor arrived, adjusted his spectacles, and gravely declared, hysteria of the nocturnal type. The cure, extended bed rest. No visitors, no books, no stimulation, no fun. This approach was known as the rest cure, made famous and infamous by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. His method involved isolating the patient in a bedroom, usually one with cheerful yellow wallpaper, and keeping her in bed for weeks, even months. No walking, no talking, just lying, eating, and receiving sponge baths from nurses trained to whisper, encouraging phrases like, "You'll feel better soon and don't read anything challenging." Historians still argue whether this cure was cruel, helpful, or just a way of making upper-class women disappear for a while. The rest cure wasn't limited to women, of course, but the gender gap was clear. Men were more likely to be diagnosed with neurasthenia, a kind of elite burnout, too many business meetings, too much reading, too many telegraphs, that's prescription, travel, light exercise, and a reduction in whiskey. Women, meanwhile, got the bed. And oh, what beds. These weren't your average lumpy piles of horsehair, no. These were beds specifically designed for nervous disorders. They had slightly elevated legs to drain excess brain heat. Some had built-in trays so patients didn't need to sit up to eat. A few even had slots for mirrors or tiny chalkboards in case the patient felt the urge to communicate without straining their voice. You imagine lying in one now. The mattress firm and unfamiliar sunlight filtered through lace curtains. A tray of poached eggs resting beside your elbow. You are not allowed to lift a finger, you must recover. Even if you're not entirely sure. From what? Then there's the fainting couch, a lounge-style chair popular in parlors and bedrooms alike, always with a single sloped arm and no backrest. It was the go-to resting place for ladies of delicate constitution who, after a particularly upsetting letter, or a glimpse of an ankle, might require immediate reclining. You may have seen one, you may have reclined on one, but you probably didn't know. It was designed under the assumption that women would faint at least once a week. That's dedication. And the best part, some doctors genuinely believed that excess mental effort caused the womb to migrate toward the brain, disrupting sleep and thought alike. That's right. Wandering wombs. Not metaphorical ones. Actual physical migration, apparently conducted in silence, while the patient read Jane Austen. Victorian medicine didn't always make sense, but it did make a lot of money. Of course, if you were poor, you didn't get fainting couches or nervous beds. You got advice like walk it off or boil nettles into tea and say your prayers. Working-class women didn't have the luxury of rest. Cures, sleeplessness, was simply part of survival. Still, there were exceptions. Some charitable doctors ran sleep clinics, or rather repose homes in cities like London and Edinburgh. These were modest boarding houses, offering quiet dark rooms, bland food, and regulated bedtime stories. Guests were discouraged from talking. Some stayed for a week, some for years. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, and in the 19th century that counted for a lot. You turn now, curling onto your side, the pillow slightly less hostile than before. The light in your room has grown stronger, but it no longer feels intrusive. Instead, it sits gently on the bedspread like a polite visitor waiting for tea. And yet, you're still not sleeping. But here's the thing. You're not fighting it anymore. You've made peace with the ghosts of Victorian sleep, with Eleanor and her yellow wallpaper, with Dr. Mitchell and his clipboard. With every fainting couch smelling salt and wandering womb in the story. The room is calm now. You are calm now. And even if sleep doesn't arrive this moment, you know at least you're in good company. You're still awake though now. It feels less like a failure and more like a choice. Or at least a shared understanding between you and the night at will. Stay quiet, and you will stay horizontal, and no one will ask too many questions. The blanket has molded to your shape. The pillow, though lumpy, no longer offends. The ticking clock ticks not as a judge, but as a gentle metronome. And outside the light has fully arrived, though the world seems reluctant to accept it. As you lie there, blinking slowly, a new thought arrives, uninvited but not unwelcome. What about couples? What happens when one person sleeps like a blessed log, and the other sounds like an entire industrial revolution happening inside their throat? Welcome to the truly delightful, slightly absurd world of Victorian snoring solutions and the marital contracts they inspired. You shift under the covers, smiling a little at the memory of Snore No More, the book you flipped through earlier. Its pages held a treasure trove of bizarre inventions, each more convoluted than the last, and all designed with one desperate goal: keeping marriages intact, despite audible breathing. In the Victorian era, the shared bed was often less about romance and more about logistics. It signaled unity, respectability, and financial practicality. But when one partner snored, oh, the drama. The social guides of the day were clear: snoring was embarrassing, undignified, and if you were the wife, absolutely not to be discussed in public. That didn't stop anyone from discussing it, of course. Couples sought solutions often ridiculous. One popular device was the anti-snoring head harness, a leather strap affixed around the jaw and crown of the head, effectively clamping the mouth shut. Elegant, not even slightly, but it was considered lovingly preventative. There were also nose clips made of brass chin cradles made from stiff linen, and even a short-lived invention called the snore ball, a lumpy sphere sewn into the back of the sleeper's nightshirt. Designed to make back sleeping uncomfortable, it worked, assuming you enjoyed waking up every 10 minutes with what felt like a walnut lodged between your ribs. Historians still argue whether these devices improved sleep or just created new reasons to file for divorce. But some couples didn't rely on gadgets, they relied on rituals. There were the rotational sleepers who traded sides of the bed each night, hoping that changing angles would reroute airflow. Then came the sequential sleepers who staggered bedtimes by hours to allow one partner to fall asleep before the Pessis Nasal concert began. Most charming of all were the contractual sleepers. Yes, real couples, especially in the upper classes, drew up informal agreements governing bedtime behavior. These might include one's obligation to take a sedative before bed, a limit on late-night reading with rustly pages, a firm ban on snacking between 10 p.m. and sunrise due to digestive noises, and in more dramatic households, clauses allowing temporary exile to the guest room. Separate bedrooms weren't common in the early Victorian years. Those were reserved for nobility or people with a suspicious number of secrets. But as the century progressed, the dual-bedroom arrangement gained popularity among the well-to-do. It was seen not as a sign of distance but of elegance, sophistication, even, dare one say, romantic maturity. You picture a couple in 1880, Mr. and Mrs. Altringham. He sleeps on the east side of the manor beneath a moose head and 3 military medals. She sleeps on the west beneath floral wallpaper and a portrait of her grandmother, glaring disapprovingly. They dine together, promenade together, but sleep apart. And somehow it works. But not everyone could afford such luxury. For most, it was the same bed every night for life, which meant compromise. Pillows between bodies, agreed upon sleeping postures. Some even tried synchronized breathing. 1, 2, inhale, exhale, hoping to train their partner into harmony. And yet snoring persisted. Enter the sleep tutors, a bizarre offshoot of the medical world. These were specialists who claimed to diagnose the sleeping mind by observing a couple in their rest habits. They took notes, they watched for twitching, they might even administer tests involving scented oils, candlelight, and whispered questions to the semi-conscious. You imagine one now, Dr. Barnaby Sleet, wrapped in a too-tight waistcoat, peering at your sleeping form with a monocle and murmuring, yes, deeply unconscious, but emotionally unresolved. Recommend peppermint steam and fewer night onions. And then, of course, came the divorce cases. Yes. By the late 19th century, snoring was cited on rare occasions in divorce petitions. not as the sole cause but as evidence of incompatibility. One such case involved a woman who described her husband's nighttime breathing as the sound of a wet accordion beneath a dying dog. The court dismissed her, but history remembered. You smile again in the dark, because there's something tender, even ridiculous about all of this. The straps and the contracts, the tiptoeing around snores, the whispered agreements sealed by candlelight, all of it pointing to a singular truth. Sleep was hard enough alone, but infinitely more complicated together. And yet people tried to be kind, to be quiet, to fold themselves smaller, to muffle their sounds and soften their presence, to love someone enough to stay in the same bed night after snoring night. And maybe that's the most Victorian thing of all. You turn on your side, the pillow is no longer lumpy somehow, the light is softer too. Your breathing slows, you imagine someone beside you snoring softly, rhythmically, like a cat purring through a scarf. It doesn't bother you now. You're not trying to sleep. You're simply here. And that's enough. The morning has officially arrived. You can feel it not just in the shifting light, but in the stillness that follows it. The hush of a city holding its breath before the bells start ringing and the boots hit cobblestones. You're still in bed, of course. You haven't slept, not fully. But something in your mind has begun to uncoil. There's less tightness behind your eyes, less pressure in your chest. The day may have begun, but still cocooned in your own quiet world. A world, let's say, filled with strange Victorian mattresses. Because while we've spent plenty of time talking about rituals, guilt, and odd contraptions strapped to faces, we've not yet explored what people were actually sleeping on. And believe me, it's worth investigating. You shift slightly, as if the very act of doing so connects you with those who once tossed and turned upon beds, stuffed with moss and squeaking metal coils. You reach under your own blanket, feel the soft give of your modern mattress, and can't help but marvel, how did they survive? The earliest Victorian mattresses were, let's be honest, primitive at best. If you were poor, you might be sleeping on palliases, essentially large sacks filled with straw hay or dried leaves. These would flatten, quickly grow mold if damp, and, unsurprisingly, attract rodents. The best you could do was fluff it daily, and pray no one stole your spot. Middle-class families often upgraded to horsehair mattresses, which, while durable, were also famously itchy, noisy, and prone to developing mysterious hard lumps that neither softened nor explained themselves. One guide recommended beating the bed with a willow rod weekly to redistribute the stuffing. Another suggested replacing the contents twice yearly with freshly combed tail hair. Freshly combed. From a tail, you lie there imagining someone delicately brushing a horse's tail for the sake of your spinal alignment. Eventually, Victorian inventors turned their attention to springs. Around the 1870s, the inner spring mattress began to appear in high society homes, an engineering marvel consisting of coiled metal layers of felt and not nearly enough testing. Early spring mattresses squeaked loudly, constantly. Every movement was met with a whine, a groan, or a distinct boing. Some were so reactive that turning over too quickly could catapult you sideways. And yet they were considered the height of modern luxury. Historians still argue whether the squeaking springs were a design flaw or a built-in moral deterrent against unseemly nighttime behavior. After all, nothing ruins an impulsive romantic moment, like the sound of a haunted accordion being stepped on. Meanwhile, the elite had options far beyond hay or metal coils, goose-down cotton batting, even wool-stuffed ticking wrapped in fine linen. These beds were softer but not always cleaner. Bedbugs didn't care for class distinctions. In fact, they seemed to prefer the warm, layered opulence of the wealthy's bedding. That's why some beds were fitted with copper linings to discourage infestation. Others had removable mattress panels for easy laundering. And for the obsessively hygienic beds, with hinges and pulleys that allowed the entire frame to be raised and aired like a hammock strung between servants. If you were lucky enough to be traveling, you might encounter the portable mattress or travel palliasse, a sort of fabric burrito stuffed with hay rolled and strapped to luggage, and expected to keep you comfortable at roadside inns that may or may not also offer roosters sleeping indoors. You shift again and realize something delightful. Your mattress doesn't squeak. It doesn't smell like hay. It hasn't collapsed in the center, forming what was lovingly called the marriage dip, a shared indentation where couples slowly rolled toward each other like socks down a drain. And yet the Victorians endured. They developed techniques to make the most of their beds. One popular method was the flip and beat, a twice-weekly ritual involving the entire household. Turning mattresses, fluffing corners, and giving them a good thump with a broomstick. It was noisy. It was dusty. It was a surprising form of cardio. Others recommended airing bedding outdoors every morning despite the city air being filled with soot ash and the occasional stray chicken. Still, it was the principle that mattered. Cleanliness was next to godliness, and bedding that smelled of morning fog and coal fires was seen as invigorating. You lie back imagining yourself as a Victorian mattress tester, flopping from bed to bed in a corset and bonnet, giving polite but pointed feedback like a bit crunchy in the middle or would prefer fewer metallic twangs beneath my ribs. You find yourself grinning now, and as the light grows brighter and the world starts to hum beyond the glass, you realize something else: you've made it through the night, not triumphantly, not dramatically, but with a kind of gentle stubbornness like a Victorian mattress, stuffed with horsehair. You've held your shape against the weight of the hours. Sleep may not have come, but your body has rested. Your mind has wandered. You've floated through the world of spring, coils, moss-stuffed pillows, and marital bed dips, and somehow that counts for something. So you curl in tighter, letting your own quiet bed hold you. The world will ask things of you soon. But not just yet. Let it wait. Let the morning be gentle. Let the mattress be still. The house is fully awake now. Somewhere downstairs there's the scrape of a chair, the gentle thump of a kettle being set on the stove. A door opens, then closes again. Outside, a cart rolls by with wheels that squeak, like mice trying to sing. And yet you remain in bed, adrift, listening not to what is but to what was, because today you're visiting the part of the house most people weren't meant to see. You're tiptoeing past the fine drapery, past the damask wallpaper, and the bookshelf of unused Bibles. You're opening the narrow door, behind the stairs, and creeping into the servants' quarters, where sleep was neither moral quandary nor philosophical pursuit. It was a luxury, and most of the time it wasn't available. Victorian servants, maids, cooks, butlers, coachmen, footmen weren't expected to rest so much as recharge briefly, before beginning again. Their schedules started before dawn and ended long after the last candle was snuffed. They were the reho, invisible gears in the household machine, and that machine never stopped. You imagine yourself as Mary, the scullery maid. She's 15, maybe 16. She's been up since 4 a.m. lighting fires, hauling coal, peeling potatoes, and washing so many dishes that her hands feel more like soap than skin by the time she's permitted to sleep. The sky is already threatening daylight again. Where does Mary sleep? In a cupboard, or what might generously be called a cubby. One narrow mattress thin as a folded towel shoved between a wall and a trunk of linens. No windows, no heating. Just a small oil lamp and a quilt she made herself from discarded rags. The pillow is a rolled apron, and the mattress stuffed with wood shavings. It's hard to imagine now, but this was normal. Entire generations of domestic workers slept in spaces that modern building codes would classify as where not to store luggage. And they were grateful for it, because the alternative was no bed at all. You roll onto your back, staring at the ceiling, trying to picture it, the hierarchy of household sleep. The master and mistress had feather beds in high-ceilinged rooms, with decorative curtains and bell pulls for nighttime needs. The children had narrower beds, possibly shared with sheets that were changed weekly. The governess slept in the SOS, Est-0, guest room unless a guest was present, in which case she was politely displaced to a cot near the coat room. The servants, they slept wherever there was space, hallways, attics. Near the scullery, one infamous household in Chelsea reportedly had 3 male servants sharing a single bed, sleeping in shifts, according to their duty rotations. They called it hot bedding, not for the reasons you might think, just body heat, and no time for the sheets to cool. Even coachmen, often seen as prestigious among the lower ranks, didn't fare better. They slept near the stables, sometimes on a pile of hay, sometimes on a wooden bench with a saddlebag as a pillow. One account describes a coachman so exhausted that he once nodded off while harnessing a horse, only to be kicked awake by said horse. His employer docked his pay for the delay. Historians still argue whether the treatment of servants was intentionally cruel or simply blind to human need. But the result was the same. Sleep was a currency. The lower classes couldn't afford to spend daily, and yet they found ways. Some maids learned to sleep in 5-minute bursts, training their bodies to snatch rest between tasks. A few developed the ability to sleep, standing up, backs braced against walls or broom closets, eyes half open in case someone entered. You lie there still as if in solidarity. Imagine waking after just 2 hours, being expected to carry trays of crystal glassware without dropping a single goblet. Imagine being scolded for yawning. Imagine getting the bedding wrong for a guest who prefers goose down to duck. Now imagine doing it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. There were few remedies for this exhaustion. Coffee, perhaps. Strong black tea. A splash of cold water in the face. But mostly just endurance. Generations of young women and not a few men surviving on determination and the occasional nap taken. On a flour sack in the pantry. And yet there were bright spots. Some households allowed Sunday sleep-ins. Others gave an occasional half-day off, usually to walk to church or visit family. Servants formed tight bonds, swapping stories in whispers after lights out. They shared biscuits, comforted each other, and even helped one another rearrange their paltry bedding to stave off the cold. There was one account of a kitchen maid who embroidered a tiny pillowcase for her friend's birthday, using thread pulled from old aprons and lace from a torn petticoat. She said it made the bed feel like a queen's just for a while. You exhale slowly, your chest rising and falling in rhythm with the clock once more. Your own bed, whatever else, suddenly feels palatial, because tonight you've remembered what sleep once cost. It wasn't about lavender oils or virtue about counting breaths or aligning with the magnetic pole. It was about time, and for many it was stolen time. So if your eyes begin to close now, heavy and slow and warm at last, know that you carry with you the quiet resilience of those who once slept standing, kneeling, hidden in cupboards, curled beside coal buckets, smiling softly at the dream of 5 minutes more. And that perhaps is enough to finally let go. There's a new kind of hush in the room now. Not the dead quiet of 3 a.m., all suspicion and ticking clocks, but the softened hush of early day, when everything is almost in motion. The walls have warmed with light. The floor no longer creaks in protest. Even the blanket has adjusted its weight to feel less like a burden and more like a presence. Something old, familiar, and forgiving. You could get up, you should. But instead you turn gently onto your side, because it's time to travel again, not to the upstairs bedrooms nor to the attics of weary maids, but far away, to where the empire reached and British officials went to bed in places their bodies never quite understood. You are now in a colonial outpost somewhere, warm, bright, and unfamiliar. The Victorians called it sleeping abroad, but that made it sound far more glamorous than it was. In truth, trying to replicate a British night's sleep in India, Hong Kong, or Kenya was often an exercise in sweaty futility and a logistical challenge of operatic proportions. You imagine yourself lying in a grand, airy bedroom in Bombay. The ceiling is high. The fan above you turns in slow, uncertain circles. The walls are hung with mosquito nets, and the air is thick, not just with heat, but with everything curry, spices from the kitchen below, coal smoke from the servants' quarters, and the endless pulse of nighttime life outside. Victorian colonials didn't sleep well. Not because they lacked comfort, but because they brought British habits into climates and cultures where those habits made absolutely no sense. For example, feather beds, soft, cozy, and perfectly designed to trap body heat in a climate where the evening temperature still hovered above 30 degrees Celsius. Officials often awoke, soaked in sweat, convinced they had malaria, only to be told by the houseboy, "No, Sahib, that is just the blanket." Still, they clung to their rituals. "Cool, sleeping be damned," wrote one official stationed in Rangoon. "A gentleman rests with decorum, not with bare feet." You imagine him now lying in bed in a full cotton nightshirt buttoned to the collar beneath a wool coverlet, sweating righteously. He will not adjust, he will not yield. He will simply write home to complain about the pillows. Of course, these expatriates didn't suffer alone. They brought households with them, servants, cooks, maids, bearers, many of whom also slept poorly, not from wool or pride, but from proximity to power. They often lived in outbuildings or courtyards, or on woven mats just outside their masters' doors, ready to respond at a bell's ring, even in the dead of night. Sleep became hierarchical. The closer you were to authority, the more fragmented your rest became, and still the officials insisted on bedroom imports. They shipped iron bed frames across oceans, had pillows sewn in Manchester and freighted to Madagascar. One governor requested his mattress be sent by sea in its own crated box packed in sawdust to prevent the loss of its internal symmetry. It arrived, smelling like a lumberyard. He was pleased. Mosquito nets became the fashion, often more elaborate than the beds themselves. White gauze hung from ceiling hoops, sometimes starched for crispness. In one amusing case, a lieutenant's wife had hers embroidered with quotes from Psalms, so that every morning she would rise, shielded in scripture. The maid reportedly was less enthusiastic about ironing it. Historians still argue whether these sleeping conditions were failures of adaptation or victories of stubborn nostalgia. To be fair, the colonials tried. They built veranda beds to catch the breeze. Some slept on rooftops, under the stars in mosquito-veiled cots. They experimented with stone floors, window cross drafts, and tea made from local sedatives, which frequently had unintended gastrointestinal consequences. One explorer, desperate for sleep, paid a local herbalist for a sachet of leaves that sent me to dreams within 10 minutes. He failed to mention the next morning's hallucinations involving a talking mongoose and an angry teapot. You imagine the sweating, the tossing, the fanning of faces with newspapers. You imagine someone lying there watching a lizard creep across the wall whispering, "We shall never sleep again, Elizabeth." And Elizabeth from the next room murmuring, "No, dear, only wait until December." But the truth is, not all colonials were miserable. Some adapted, some listened. They traded the feather bed for a charpai, a woven rope bed common across India, airy and light. Others took to hammocks, strung under tin roofs, swinging slowly in the wind. They napped in the heat of the day and lived more fully by candlelight. Sleep became local. Finally, yet the letters sent home told a different story of brave, sleepless nights of stoic suffering and humid silence of dreams postponed by duty. Sleep, like everything else in the colonies, became part of the mythology, something sacrificed in the name of empire. You shift again, your own bed still cool, your ceiling still. The breeze through your window isn't tropical but soft enough to remind you that comfort is a choice as much as a condition. And tonight, or morning, or whenever this liminal hour is, you have chosen to remember those who tried to sleep in beds too warm, in places too foreign, under skies that whispered in unfamiliar tones. You don't pity them, but you do thank them, because they remind you of this. Sleep is not a guarantee, it is a strange and delicate privilege. It changes with place, with culture, with temperature. But everywhere it is sought, and here now in your own corner of stillness you are free to seek it too. The breeze stirs faintly now, tracing cool fingers across your cheek. You don't move, just listen. The world outside is officially awake. Footsteps clinking, china, a bird, shrilling far too confidently for someone so small. But here under your blanket time stretches like warm toffee. The sun can wait, and so can you. You roll gently to your back and imagine just for fun that you're not lying in a modern bed at all, but in a curious invention from the late 19th century. Something so uniquely Victorian, so completely committed to the promise of rest, that it borders on the theatrical. Tonight, or rather this dawn, you're lying in a bed powered by electricity. Welcome to the dazzling, occasionally alarming world of tonic culture and electrosleep therapy. Let's begin with the basics. The Victorians were obsessed with tonics, bottled promises of health and vigor, sleep energy, digestion, memory, you name it, there was a tonic for it. Many were no more effective than colored water. Many were in fact just alcohol, often sweetened and dyed a suspicious shade of amber. You picture one now, Professor Chalmers' nocturnal draft, claiming to restore the nerves and calm the feverish brow. Ingredients: valerian root laudanum, and a sprinkle of something. Labeled only as Peruvian bitters, it probably tasted like licorice, and poor decisions. Victorians adored branding. The word tonic alone was enough to sell out a product. Add a few buzzwords. Medicinal electro-restorative for ladies, and your potion could make it from Whitechapel to Westminster, by horse cart, in under a week. Of course, not everyone trusted liquid remedies. Some preferred the cutting edge, electricity. Yes, it was new, it was misunderstood, and so naturally it was used on people's faces. By the 1880s, electrotherapeutics had become a genuine movement. Sleep problems, nerves, melancholia, weak spines, all ripe for electrical correction. And where there was demand, there were devices. Imagine lying in bed not just with a warm blanket, but with a helmet of brass and wires connected to a box the size of a sewing machine. The dial hums softly. A faint current pulses across your scalp. You are assured this is perfectly normal. These contraptions went by many names: the electro-soporific harness, the neurotonic diadem, the magnetic night regulator. None were particularly effective. But they looked convincing, and in a society that prized appearances that often counted more than results. One doctor, a Dr. Templeton Grave, swore by his sleep chair, a reclined leather monstrosity wired to generate soft currents through the spine. His patients included both the sleepless and the spiritually misaligned. He claimed to have invented nervous realignment via electrostatic rest. His medical license, if he had one, was never found. Historians still argue whether these devices were pseudoscience or early prototypes of modern treatments. After all, we now use sleep trackers, white noise machines, and even light-based therapy. Perhaps Dr. Templeton Grave wasn't entirely mad, just 140 years too early. The Victorian sleep salons, however, were quite real. Yes, salons. In certain fashionable corners of London and Paris, one could book an appointment for a sleep session. The experience often included reclining in a velvet-lined bed or chaise, being wrapped in lightly weighted blankets, listening to soothing phonograph recordings, usually someone reading psalms in an encouraging tone, receiving light electric pulses at the temples, wrists, or soles of the feet, and finally, a lavender compress laid over the eyes while a salon attendant whispered encouraging phrases like, "Let go of the world's troubles," or "You are no longer at dinner with your in-laws." The sessions were expensive, exclusive, and largely placebo. But attendees left refreshed, if only from the novelty. You smile faintly at the idea of a posh Victorian man nodding off to a faint electrical tingle and a monologue about sheep. You imagine his mustache twitching with every buzz. But there was another kind of tonic, one that wasn't bottled or wired. Movement. Some physicians rejected the sitting still and zapping approach and recommended controlled motion. Gentle rocking. Slow walking before bed. Rhythmic, swaying in specially designed chairs. Some patients were even advised to ride trains at night, believing the repetitive sounds and vibrations would induce sleep. It sometimes worked. More often it led to motion sickness and an increased fear of tunnels. You lie there now, your own heartbeat, the only rhythm you need. No tonic, no wires, no powdered magnesium or rose-scented ether. Just stillness. But it's easy to see how the Victorians reached for so much. The era was full of noise, ticking clocks, growing cities, gas lamps, hissing trains, screeching into new stations, letters from far-off colonies arriving by the dozen. People were overwhelmed. They were awake in every sense, socially, politically, emotionally. And so they tried to switch off the only way they knew how. Through invention, sleep became something you could measure, track, bottle, electrify, or steam into submission. And while most of these methods were absurd, their longing is familiar. Even now, in this moment of calm, you understand it. Because sleep doesn't always arrive, just because you ask. Sometimes it must be coaxed. So you close your eyes again, not because you expect anything, but because now you're finally ready to let yourself try. No buzz, no brass. Just you, stillness, and the knowledge that you are not alone in wanting rest. You close your eyes for a moment, thinking it might finally happen. Sleep arriving like a Victorian butler, quiet, courteous, possibly holding a warm cup of milk. It does not. But what does arrive is a yawn, slow, long, the kind that starts at your chest and unfurls like a sail catching wind. And suddenly you remember that yawning itself was once suspicious. Yes, tonight we enter one of the most bizarre and briefly alarming episodes of Victorian sleep history, the Great Yawning Panic. It started as so many Victorian oddities did, with a letter to the editor. In 1874, The Lancet, a serious medical journal not usually known for theatrics, published a complaint from a physician who had observed a sharp increase in persistent yawning among young men of leisure. He hypothesized that something in modern life was disrupting the natural sequence of rest, and called for an urgent scientific inquiry into this facial epidemic. This might have been ignored, but within weeks it was echoed in newspapers across London, yawning the silent threat to moral fortitude, railway passengers, and the rise of indolent breathing. Are corsets making us tired, or just bored? Suddenly, yawning wasn't just an involuntary twitch, it was a symbol, a warning sign, a social symptom. People were seen yawning in church, in court, in carriages, on rooftops. Theories blossomed fast at blink. One blamed it on the telegraph, suggesting our nervous systems weren't meant to receive information so quickly. Another blamed railways, claiming that the gentle rocking lulled passengers into micro-sleeps that destabilized the passengers' bodies, natural rhythms. A third theory pointed to literary overstimulation, noting that young ladies reading too many novels, particularly those of French origin, were observed yawning while still at breakfast. You lie in bed now, stifling another yawn and feeling vaguely accused. Physicians began prescribing remedies. These included brisk, walking in morning fog, chewing lightly salted lemons before speaking, applying a cold spoon to the back of the neck, reading aloud from the Psalms in an energetic tone. There was even a brief fad of yawn suppressors, devices resembling dental headgear that gently forced the mouth closed with rubber bands. You picture someone wearing one to a dinner party, trying to eat soup through clenched teeth. Probably blamed the French too. Historians still argue whether this epidemic was real or simply the product of mass suggestibility combined with boredom. After all, the late 19th century was full of strange anxieties, phantom illnesses, electromagnetic fatigue, and a growing sense that industrial progress might be outpacing human biology. But the yawning panic was different. It was visible. You could point to it, see it happen, hear the little gasp and stretch. It was proof. People said that the modern world was too much. Of course, yawning wasn't new. Even ancient texts spoke of it plenty. The elder believed it expelled bad air. Others said it protected the soul from slipping out while sleeping. But the Victorians, they gave it a moral spin. Yawning became a failure of character. To yawn in company was impolite. To yawn while being spoken to was offensive. To yawn at your husband's opinions about chimney tacks, practically treason. Etiquette manuals offered instruction. If you had to yawn, it was best to turn away discreetly, place one gloved hand over the mouth, tilt the head downward in a thoughtful attitude, immediately cough as if to distract from the gesture, then apologize and reference the weather. You imagine yourself at a Victorian soiree, stifling a yawn with dramatic flair, muttering something about the humidity of March, and earning nods of approval for your restraint. And yet, despite all this posturing, yawning refused to be tamed. People yawned in theaters and Parliament, even during Queen Victoria's own public appearances. The panic gradually faded by the 1880s, dismissed as a curiosity filed away alongside other brief Victorian obsessions like mustache tamers, window tax riots, and the fear that tomatoes might trigger melancholy. You shift gently, now breathing slower. Your own yawn comes again, but this time you let it rise. No guilt, no spoon to the neck, no psalms at full volume, just a soft sigh curling from your lips like steam from a morning teacup. Because here's the truth. The Victorians couldn't quite say aloud, we yawn because we need rest. Because we're alive. Because we're trying. And sometimes yawning isn't a failure. It's a message, a whisper from the body saying, enough now, you've thought enough, felt enough, let's drift. So you, though, maybe, almost. Your limbs are soft now, heavy, but in the good way. The way a loaf of bread rests just before rising. The world hums gently behind the walls. Kettles boiling, shoes crossing hallways, voices muffled by wood and distance. But in here, in this still dim bedroom, you are floating. Sleep hasn't come yet, not truly. But it no longer feels out of reach. It's there just beyond the next breath. Or perhaps the one after that. And what's standing between you and it? Dreams. Because if there's anything the Victorians managed to make more complicated than sleep, it was what happened during it. Tonight we wander into the velvet-curtained world of Victorian dream interpretation and nightmare prevention. A realm where symbolism reigned, science tiptoed cautiously, and the average person believed their subconscious was constantly trying to send telegrams from the beyond. You turn slightly, the pillow embracing you like an old friend with strange opinions. You imagine a time when waking from a dream meant not just blinking groggily at the ceiling, but grabbing a pencil and a copy of Dr. Littleton's Guide to Nocturnal Wisdom, or perhaps The Lady's Dream Companion, Interpretations for All, 96 Common Night Visions. These guides were everywhere, from dusty bookstores to the back pages of etiquette manuals. They offered meaning to every shape that visited you while you slept. Dreaming of teeth falling out, you would soon be betrayed by a family member. Dreaming of staircases, a secret ambition, dreaming of ducks, a financial opportunity, dreaming of a broken mirror, moral weakness, or indigestion, possibly both. dreaming of Prince Albert, repressed admiration, or just too much time reading the newspaper. Victorians didn't just interpret dreams, they feared them, because to dream was to admit vulnerability, and in a society that demanded control over your body, your time, your voice, dreams were unruly. They were improper, especially nightmares. Oh, the horror of bad dreams. Entire treatises were written about night terrors and nocturnal visitations. Scholars debated whether they stemmed from digestion, demonic interference, or excessive piano playing. One respected physician insisted that sleeping on your left side encouraged nightmares. Another swore by rubbing the soles of the feet with vinegar. Still another recommended placing a Bible beneath your pillow, but only if opened to Psalm 91. Historians still argue whether these were genuine beliefs, or simply attempts to sell vinegar and Bibles. Of course, the most superstitious among the population turned to dream amulets. Small sachets of herbs, lavender, mugwort, valerian tucked beneath pillows or sewn into nightcaps. Some included small pewter charms, shaped like owls or stars. These were said to anchor the soul, preventing it from wandering too far while the body lay still. Because yes, some Victorians believed that during sleep your soul left your body to roam, and if it stayed out too long you might not wake up at all. You pull your own blanket higher, suddenly aware of how good it feels to stay tethered. Others believed in dream bleeding, a technique whereby after a disturbing dream, you wrote it down in red ink and burned the page before breakfast. Symbolically, this banished the vision. Realistically, it made your bedroom smell like panic and matches. There were also nightmare machines. Truly, one invention patented in 1887 was called the somno-suppressor. It resembled a cross between a phonograph and a hat stand, designed to emit low tones through a funnel placed near the sleeper's head. The manufacturer claimed it could stabilize dream frequencies and produce docile nocturnal visions. Reviews were mixed. Another was simply a metal ring slipped around the finger or toe. If you tensed during a nightmare, the pressure would wake you up, provided you didn't dream of losing your toes. In which case, well, that was your own fault. You sigh now, eyes fluttering shut and open again. You're not dreaming yet, but the borderland has grown soft. You can feel the images coming, not fully formed, but whispering at the edges. You wonder, what would a Victorian make of your dreams? Would they write them down, place them in a sealed envelope, and show them to a trained medium in a lace collar? Would they try to exorcise your anxieties with peppermint oil and softly spoken Latin? Or would they, like you, simply marvel at the brain's nighttime theater? Because that's what dreams are, strange luminous scenes stitched from memory and mystery. A parade of faces you half remember. A staircase that leads to a library that smells like the sea. A cat that speaks. A friend you haven't met yet. Dreams are not moral or immoral. They just are. And no matter how many books the Victorians wrote, no one ever quite figured them out. And maybe that's the point. You roll once more. The clock ticks. The blanket shifts. Somewhere in your mind an owl takes flight and disappears into fog. It may return later. It may not. You're okay, because sleep, like dreaming, is not a problem to solve. It's a door you gently lean against until it finally opens. The edge of sleep is so close now you can almost taste it, soft and weightless, like the first snowflake on your tongue. Your limbs lie quiet. Your breath has slowed. And even the Ponclass ticking clock has faded to the background like a distant metronome keeping time with your heartbeat. But before the door to dreams swings open completely, you find yourself drifting into one final Victorian ritual. Something quaint, something warm, something absolutely ill-advised if you want to sleep well. You find yourself partaking in midnight tea and toast. Yes, we've arrived at that quietly delicious contradiction in Victorian sleep culture. The nighttime snack. It was both a desperate last resort and a beloved indulgence. One part insomnia cure, one part unspoken rebellion. You picture it now, a candlelit kitchen at 2:30 a.m. The fire has gone to embers. A heavy shawl wraps around your shoulders. The scullery is quiet. The world has forgotten you. And in that quiet bubble of wakefulness, you strike a match set, the kettle, and reach for the tin of digestive biscuits. In upper-class homes, nighttime snacking was often discouraged, a weak habit of the undisciplined, as one etiquette book put it. But behind closed doors, it happened a lot, especially among women. especially among writers, and especially among those who had spent hours trying everything else. Lavender compresses, scripture readings, even counting how many folds were in the curtains, because sometimes you just needed toast. Warm buttery, slightly charred at the edges, maybe with a dab of marmalade or a curl of cheese, and alongside it a cup of weak tea. Chamomile if you had it, milk and sugar if you didn't. The goal wasn't to wake you up, but to comfort you into letting go. One diarist from 1,893 admitted she would sneak down to the kitchen twice a week for a small plate of bread and dripping, convinced it helped her push back the clouds of fretful thought. Another gentleman wrote proudly that he had trained the household cat to arrive at 3 a.m., thus ensuring company while partaking of a quiet biscuit. Historians still argue whether these snacks actually helped people sleep or simply gave them something to look forward to during sleepless nights. But either way, they became part of the Victorian bedtime landscape. You imagine it now. Your fingers curled around a warm teacup, its rim chipped from years of faithful use. The tea is slightly bitter. The toast crunches softly, and for the first time all night, you feel nourished, not just in the body, in the soul, because while the Victorian world wrapped sleep in moral tightrope and medical mystery, there was something profoundly human about this tiny ritual. To rise in the night, to feed yourself gently, to acknowledge that you are not a machine, that you are not failing for being awake, you are simply alive. Even Queen Victoria herself, stoic, reserved, famously composed, was said to have occasionally requested night refreshments. These included tea cakes, thin slices of meat, or ginger biscuits. Her staff, ever formal, referred to it as Her Majesty's optional schedule meal. Optional indeed. Others went a step further, keeping comfort trays by the bedside. A small dish with candied ginger, a single fig, perhaps a square of chocolate, something tiny and sweet. A love letter to the self written in crumbs and spoonfuls. There were even cookbooks that included sleepy recipes, custards infused with nutmeg, barley water, and thin broths simmered for hours. Entire domestic science courses were dedicated to nighttime digestibility. One particularly detailed syllabus spent 4 days on the pros and cons of eating porridge after midnight. You breathe in now slowly. The idea of warm porridge doesn't tempt you, but the kindness of it does. The sheer gentleness of offering yourself a small, undeserved treat. Not because it will solve the problem, but because it might just soothe the sharp corners. The best kind of comfort rarely comes with guarantees, just warmth, familiarity, a soft place to land. That's what the tea and toast were about. Not nutrition, not ritual. Permission. Permission to be awake, to be tender, to be human. You shift again, more settled now, as if the very memory of that kitchen has weighted your bones into the mattress. The light outside is stronger now, but you're no longer racing it, no longer trying to win. The clock ticks, your breath steadies. If you could toast a slice of bread right now, you might. Instead, you let the thought melt into you like butter on crust. Warmth, bitterness, sweetness. A reminder that sleep, when it finally comes, doesn't need to be chased. It just needs to be welcomed. And so you close your eyes. Still no promises. Just quiet. Just you. You are nearly there now. Not quite asleep, but wrapped in something softer than wakefulness. The room is no longer a place of things, of wallpaper and bed frames and ticking clocks. It is a feeling, a hush, a space between breaths. Your thoughts drift more slowly now, more dreamlike. You no longer follow them, you float through them, and just as you're ready to let go completely, a whisper of guilt tickles your mind. Because despite everything, your careful rituals, your foot baths, your chamomile, your toast, you napped earlier, and in the eyes of Victorian society, that might have been your gravest error of the day. Welcome to one of the most curiously shameful acts in 19th century life, the nappe scandal. A sin, a secret luxury, often indulged in, rarely ad. You turn onto your side again, pressing your cheek to the pillow, smiling at the absurdity, because in a world obsessed with productivity, taking rest during daylight was seen as a kind of surrender, a refusal, a whispered, no thank you to empire, ambition, and the Protestant work ethic. Victorian advice manuals were ruthless on this point. The upright man does not nap, wrote one health reformer in 1852. He perseveres and finds in fatigue a higher purpose. which is exactly the kind of thing someone writes when they've never done laundry by hand or scrubbed coal soot out of lace. The reality, of course, was far more human. People napped. Women in particular were often photographed in fainting poses not because they were frail but because they were tired. Corsets, emotional labor, constant vigilance over propriety, and the crushing monotony of being pleasant for hours on end, all of it took a toll. So they stole naps, in libraries, behind curtains, on fainting couches under the pretense of resting one's eyes. Some even trained themselves to sleep upright, in parlors appearing alert, but unreachable. Men too were not immune. Bank clerks dozed behind ledgers, tailors nodded off between fittings, and factory workers working 15-hour shifts learned the art of blinking naps, mastering the ability to dream in 15 seconds flat. Still, the stigma persisted. To nap was to fall out of rhythm with the working world. It was a luxury associated with poets, invalids, and the morally ambiguous world of continental culture. The French napped, the Italians napped, and look what they were like, said the Brent, Victorian disapprovingly. One London pamphlet from 1877 described napping as a practice of the lower races and certain species of animal. You can almost hear the author gasping at the notion of someone dozing in a public park. Shocking, indulgent, practically criminal, and yet even among the most rigidly scheduled households, nap rooms began to appear. Not officially, of course. They were called rest parlors, quiet lounges, or in the most euphemistic term imaginable, undisturbed sanctuaries. But they served one purpose: to allow the body a moment of rebellion. You imagine one now. A small, quiet room, thick carpet, curtains drawn. A chaise lounge with a pillow tucked discreetly beneath a lace antimacassar. No clocks, no mirrors. Just the soft scent of lavender and furniture polish. You aren't supposed to be there, but no one stops you. 15 minutes, 20. Just long enough to be reborn. One governess, writing in a private diary in 1891, confessed to sneaking away during her young charge's drawing lessons and lying on the rug with her eyes closed. I cannot keep pace with the girls unless I retreat from their chatter. Now and then, she wrote, I call it my silence ritual. They need not know. You wonder how many others had their own rituals. The old man who closed his eyes while listening to the clock. The baker who leaned on a flour sack in the afternoon sun. The maid who dozed in the linen closet surrounded by warmth and starch. The student who pretended to study Latin but was really visiting a dream. Napping was never about laziness. It was about self-rescue. It was survival carved into the day like a secret passageway. So if today you feel yourself drifting, nodding, sinking into the mattress a little deeper, don't resist it. Don't guilt yourself. Don't summon Miss Prudence Ashworth and her TSK Teesking pamphlets. Let go. You've earned this. In fact, you probably earned it 3 days ago. Your body knows, your breath knows, and the room quiet and golden now knows too. So nap, not because you must, but because you may. The room is warm now. Not hot, not stuffy, but the kind of warm that settles on your shoulders like a shawl knitted by someone who loves you. There's a softness to the air, a gentleness to the light. Even the birds outside are quieter now, as if they too have slipped into second sleep. You're barely holding on to consciousness, but just enough to remember one last tale before you surrender to the quiet. A tale of nighttime mischief, of half-sleep oddities, of the kinds of things people did in the night, and then in the morning pretended absolutely never happened. Tonight, or what's left of it, we drift into the strange and scandalous Victorian fascination with sleepwalking and other night crimes. Now, to be clear, the Victorians didn't exactly understand sleepwalking, but they adored talking about it in hushed tones over tea and newspapers in courtrooms because sleepwalking blurred the line between control and chaos, and in a brassed society built on manners that was downright terrifying. To walk while asleep was to become someone else, and in Victorian England that someone was usually inconvenient. You shift slightly now, imagining the wooden floor under your bare feet. Cool, creaky. You're not sure if you're dreaming or not. You don't remember leaving the bed, but there you are moving through your own house like a visitor. This was the sleepwalker's story. A person seemingly awake. Eyes open but unfocused limbs. Obedient but mind somewhere far away. Some were harmless. They folded linens, rearranged chairs, One famously peeled a single apple perfectly in their sleep, then returned to bed as though nothing had happened. But others caused trouble. Take the case of Thomas Netherby, a quiet solicitor who one night sleepwalked out of his townhouse and was found 2 streets over, knocking on a bakery window and demanding the return of the swans. He had no memory of this in the morning. The Mercis in the morning. Swans were never explained. Or Miss Margaret Ellsworth, who it was said routinely opened and closed the same drawer 50 times during sleep, always the 3rd drawer of her dressing table, and always while humming what may have been Greensleeves. She was otherwise quite normal. Then there were the court cases. Oh yes, Victorian judges were occasionally asked to rule on crimes committed during unconsciousness. One man charged with theft claimed he had removed the money in a trance, believing he was redistributing tithes. Another, accused of setting fire to his own curtains, insisted he was dreaming of hunting pheasants. The most dramatic cases involved violence rare but not unheard of. In one infamous trial, a husband who struck his wife during the night claimed to be dreaming of swatting flies. The court was divided. Was it a lie? A delusion? A symptom of nervous fever, brought on by overexposure to steam railways? Historians still argue whether most of these cases were genuine performative or simply misunderstood. But the public was enthralled. Sleepwalking became a plot device in novels, a source of gossip in drawing rooms, and occasionally, a very branchous, convenient excuse. One particularly smug essayist even called it the last honest crime, claiming that only in sleep does man act without the stains of civilization. He was later sued for libel by his brother, whom he accused of stealing pies in his sleep. And then, of course, there were the sleep talkers. Not quite walkers, but close cousins in the realm of nocturnal oddities. The Victorians were both fascinated and deeply unsettled by those who spoke aloud during sleep. There were stories of men confessing secrets in the night, of women whispering names they would never dare utter while awake. One boarding house claimed it had lost 5 guests in a month because a man on the top floor kept shouting stock prices in his sleep. He was apparently accurate. Etiquette manuals even advised ignoring anything heard during sleep. To repeat it was considered vulgar. To act on it was worse. Because what happens in the dreaming mind, they said, is not for waking ears. And yet, you wonder, don't you? What would you say? What would you do? Have you ever rearranged your sheets in perfect rows Saturday up suddenly, and then flopped down again like a puppet with its strings cut? Have you ever woken with your slippers missing, only to find them placed neatly beneath the bed? Have you ever spoken a word you didn't mean, but somehow still meant? You exhale slowly. You haven't sleepwalked. Not tonight, but your thoughts have. Wandering from horsehair mattresses, to electrified headbands, to whispered dreams, and stolen toast. And now they return shuffling gently back into bed like children caught out of bounds. You welcome them home. You close your eyes. You do not move. And if you dream of wandering through candlelit corridors in your nightgown softly muttering about swans, well, that's between you and the night. You're almost there now. The world is beginning to slip beneath you slowly, quietly, like a ship descending into fog. Your body has grown heavier than the bed. You can no longer tell if your eyes are closed by choice or by surrender. You've stopped chasing sleep, and in return, it has finally come near. But before you drift fully, let's pause at one last resting place. Not a mattress, not a tonic, not a clock, a cure, or a complaint. Just acceptance. Because the Victorians tried everything, you've seen it. You've walked their soot-smudged bedrooms, sniffed their lavender-scented nonsense, worn their snore-preventing contraptions. You've counted teacups, read dream guides, entertained a brief but meaningful crush on a footbath. And after all that, most of them still slept or didn't, just like you do now. Eventually, imperfectly, tenderly, with great effort or none at all. There's comfort in that. You imagine yourself once more in a small Victorian bedroom, not the grand chamber of a London townhouse, or the sun-drenched quarters of an overextended colonial governor, but something simpler. A narrow room. Modest wallpaper. A single dot. Window cracked open to let in air that smells of chimney smoke and morning bread. The bed isn't perfect. The springs groan, the mattress sags slightly in the middle. But it holds you. You shift. Not to escape the discomfort, but to meet it. The blanket, scratchy at first, is now a friend. The pillow once too flat now simply is. And the silence. It's not accusing anymore, it's listening. This is what the Victorians never quite wrote in their pamphlets, their novels, their patent proposals. That rest is not something you earn, it's not a test to pass or a virtue to perform, it's something your body knows how to do. If you if you forgive yourself for being tired, if you allow the night to be quiet even when your mind is loud, if you stop fearing the clock, that's when sleep arrives. Not with fireworks or fanfare, but like this, like now. You close your eyes again, this time not to try but simply to be. Your breath slows. The bed hold. The world keeps turning. The birds outside are quiet now. Even the ticking has gone soft. And whatever comes next, dream waking or something in between you, are welcome in it. Wind down 300 words. So just rest here a little longer. No pressure, no judgment. No need to fix or solve or change a single thing. Let the bed beneath you feel like a small steady boat, just large enough to carry your body, just soft enough to forgive your weight. Let your shoulders fall. Let your jaw loosen. Let the furrow in your brow smooth out like cooled wax. There is no need to think, no need to move, only to breathe. And with each breath you drift a little farther from the noise of the waking world. From the voices, the lists, the worries, the trying, let them all float away. You are safe here. You are enough here. Even if you didn't sleep all night, even if your thoughts wandered, even if you counted 100 teacups and still never found the edge of dreams, you are resting now. And that truly is the beginning of everything good. So rest. No more stories. No more clocks. Just you. And the hush that waits on the other side of wakefulness. Sleep is coming. Not fast. Not loud. Just patiently. Lovingly. Just like this.